The board came loose on a Tuesday, the way most things in Renee Carter's life seemed to come loose, quietly and at the worst possible hour. It was the grey hour before her shift, the one she kept for herself, and she was carrying 2 bags of trash to the cans behind the duplex when she heard it, a snap, then a slow groan of old pine giving way. The fence between her yard and the empty lot next door had dropped one of its slats into the weeds, and through the gap she could see the back windows of the building. She had no idea would decide everything for her. She set the bags down. She had a hammer in the kitchen drawer, and 40 minutes before the bus, she did not think about whose fence it was. She thought, the way she always thought, that a thing broken in front of her was a thing she could fix. What she did not know, standing there in the cold, with a loose board in her hands, was that the man who owned the lot, the fence, and the very building she slept in, was about to start watching her. And what he learned would change the shape of her whole year. She had lived at 1140 Del Mar for 6 years. 2 daughters, 1 bathroom, a radiator that knocked all winter like someone asking to be let in. Renee was 34. She cleaned rooms at the Carrington Hotel downtown, the kind of place where a single night cost more than she made in a week, and she had learned to fold a towel into a shape that looked like a swan because a guest had once cried when she saw it and tipped her $20. $20 was groceries. $20 was the difference between the light bill being a problem this month or next. She kept a list of those differences in her head the way other people kept songs. That first morning she nailed the slat back in place with 3 quick strikes, squared it, tested it with her palm, and made the bus with 4 minutes to spare. She thought that was the end of it. The fence was old, though, and old things ask for attention the way old people do, a little at a time, and the next week it was a different board, and the week after that, a post that had begun to lean. Renee got into the habit of checking it on her grey Tuesday hour, a nail here, a scrap of 2x4 braced against the lean. Once she dug out the base of a post that had rotted and packed it with gravel, she carried home from the lot in an old ice cream bucket, the lid of it long lost, a ring of dried paint around the rim from some project years gone. She kept her tools in a canvas bag that had been her father's, a claw hammer with a handle worn smooth and pale where his hand and then hers had held it, a flat pry bar, a coffee tin of mismatched nails she sorted by size on the kitchen table at night while the girls did homework. She did it because the gap in the fence let the neighborhood dogs into her small square of yard, and because her younger girl, Tasha, was 6 and liked to play out there. And a mother does the math on a 6-year-old and an open fence without being asked. She did it too because there was a plainer thing under all of it. A day at the Carrington was a day of making other people's rooms look as if no one had ever been tired in them, stripping the beds, wiping the glass, erasing herself from every surface before she left. Hess. The fence was the one thing all week that kept the mark of her hands. She could come back the next morning and see it standing where she had set it, and on a life made mostly of vanishing labour, a thing that stayed put was worth a cold half hour. Her older daughter, Maya, was 11 and watched everything. She kept a spiral notebook of facts about animals and corrected the television when it got them wrong, and she had a way of going quiet and thoughtful that made grown people forget she was in the room and say things they would not have said in front of a child. One cold morning she came out to the back step in her socks, arms wrapped around herself against the air, and watched her mother kneel in the dirt and work a stubborn nail, and she asked her why she bothered fixing a fence that wasn't even theirs. Renee did not look up right away. She set the nail, drove it, tested the board with her palm. Then she wiped her hands on her jeans and said the thing her own mother used to say, that you take care of what's in front of you and you let God sort the rest. Maya rolled her eyes the way 11-year-olds do when their mothers say true things and went back inside to where it was warm. She remembered it, though. Children remember the things you do not think they are listening to, and they carry them years past the morning they were said, and take them out again when they finally make sense. Across the lot, in the building, Renee cleaned past every morning without a second glance. A man named Walter Boyd kept an office on the 3rd floor with a window that looked down on exactly that stretch of fence. Walter was 58. He owned 11 buildings on the near west side, including 1140 Del Mar, and he had bought most of them in the years when nobody else wanted them, when the neighborhood was a place people were leaving rather than coming to. He did not advertise what he owned. He drove a plain sedan and wore the same grey coat for a decade, and the people who rented from him knew him, if they knew him at all, as a name on a lease and a number to call when the heat went out. Walter had been having a hard year, though the word he would have used was quiet. His wife of 30 years had passed the previous spring, and he had discovered that grief did not fill a day so much as hollow it out, and that the hours he used to spend not thinking about his buildings were now hours he spent at the window of his office, looking at nothing. That was how he first saw Renee. A woman in a thin coat kneeling at the fence line in the grey light, hammering a board back into place that he had assumed would simply fall down one season and stay down the way fences did. He watched her finish and stand and brush off her knees and walk away toward the bus stop. He thought she must be one of the tenants from the duplex, though he could not have said which. He thought she would not come back. People did not, in his experience, repair what they did not own. She came back the next week. Walter was not a sentimental man, or he had not been before the spring. There was something about the regularity of it, though, that caught in him like a splinter. Every Tuesday in the grey hour the woman returned to the fence. Sometimes she only checked it, running her hand along the top rail, and walked on. Sometimes she knelt and worked. Once he watched her struggle for 10 full minutes with a post that would not come true, and he found himself standing at the glass with his coffee going cold, leaning the way you lean when you are watching someone try to lift something just past their strength, willing it up for them. When the post finally squared, she sat back on her heels and pressed the back of her wrist to her forehead. And even from 3 floors up, he could see that she was smiling. Not at anyone, just at the work done. He started keeping a thermos by the window so the coffee would stay hot. This is the part of the story where you might already feel where it is going, and you would be partly right and partly wrong, the way we usually are about other people. Stay with it. The shape of a thing matters less than how it lands. Walter could have walked down. He told himself in those first weeks that he did not want to embarrass her, that a man appearing out of a building to thank a woman for fixing his fence might make her feel watched, might make her stop. The truth, though, the one he only admitted to himself much later, was that he did not know how to talk to people anymore. Eleanor had done that for them both. The talking, the remembering of names and birthdays, and which neighbour had a son in the service. Since the spring he had let a silence grow around himself like a yard let go to weed, and he did not know how to walk back through it. So he watched. And he learned the woman's habits the way you learn a song you keep hearing through a wall. He learned that she favoured her right shoulder when she lifted. He learned that she always tested her work with her open palm, 3 taps, as if asking the wood whether it agreed with her. He learned that on the cold mornings she brought a travel mug she held against her cheek between tasks, and that on the day it rained she came anyway in a green poncho that had seen better years, and braced a leaning post in the downpour because waiting a week would have let it fall. What he did not learn, because he could not see it from the window, was the rest of her days. The double shift on Thursdays, the second one starting at 4 when the first had begun at 6, so that she rode the bus home in the full dark, with her feet a single throb of ache and her uniform smelling of other people's cigarettes and cleaning spray. The way she counted bus fare into a coffee can on the kitchen counter, quarters in one stack and dimes in another, and how the stack told her without a calendar how close to the edge the month had drifted. The supervisor at the Carrington, a brisk woman named Denise, who timed the room turns with a stopwatch in her head and docked you if a checkout ran long, and who had once held Renee back after a shift to tell her, not unkindly, that the swan towels were a nice touch, but they were not on the cleaning standard and not to let them slow her down. Rennie kept folding them anyway on her own seconds, because a guest who cried over a folded towel was a person who had been reached, and being able to reach a stranger she would never meet was one of the few powers a hotel maid was allowed to keep. He did not see the night Tasha ran a fever, and Renee sat up with her until 3 with a cool cloth and a thermometer and a prayer said low, and went to work at 6 because a missed shift was a missed shift, and the Carrington did not care that your baby was sick. He did not see the eviction notice that came in October, the one Renee read twice at the kitchen table and then folded into careful quarters and slid into the coffee can behind the bus fare, where the worst things went. The notice was a mistake. Renee did not know that yet either. She only knew what it said, which was that the rent on 1140 Delmar was going up by $200 a month at the turn of the year, and that $200 was a number she did not have and could not make appear, no matter how many swans she folded. It came on a Wednesday in a window envelope, and she stood at the mailbox and read it twice in the cold before she trusted herself to carry it inside. She made dinner first. She helped Maya with a worksheet on the water cycle and listened to Tasha explain at length why the grey cat with the torn was named Captain and could not be named anything else. She washed the dishes. She did all the ordinary things because the ordinary things were a kind of railing she could hold, and only after the girls were down did she take the notice back out and sit with it at the kitchen table under the one light and do the arithmetic she already knew the answer to. The rent was $800. It would be $1,000. She brought home on a good month $1,400. There was the light, the gas, the bus, the food, the small endless leaks of a life with 2 children, and there was no $200 hiding anywhere in it. She had been one careful month ahead of the water her whole adult life, and the water had finally found the gap. She did not cry at the table. She had a rule about that. The girl's bedroom door was thin, and a mother's crying carries through a thin door and lands on a child like a stone, and Renee would not do that to them. She turned the notice over and over in her hands, the cheap paper soft already at the folds, and she thought about all the things $200 was. It was Maya's field trip in the spring. It was the dentist she had been putting off. It was the small cushion, $40 at a time, that she had been building in the coffee can for 2 years against exactly this kind of morning, and which this kind of morning would now swallow whole. She washed her face in the cold tap and pressed a towel to it until the heat went out of her eyes, and she folded the notice into careful quarters and slid it into the coffee can on the counter behind the bus fare where the worst things went. Then she went to bed and lay awake doing the math again, as if it might come out different, listening to the radiator knock its patient question into the dark. And the next Tuesday in the grey hour she went out and fixed the fence. Because the fence was a thing she could still fix, and on a morning when nothing else would hold that counted for something. Walter saw her that morning and thought she looked tired in a new way. He had no idea about the notice. The notice had not come from him. That was the thing he would spend the rest of the story setting right, though he did not know it yet. Standing at his window with his hot coffee, watching a woman he had never spoken to brace his fence against the wind. The notice had come from a man named Curtis Vale. Curtis managed Walter's properties. He had managed them for 9 years, and he was good at the part of the job that showed on a spreadsheet and bad at the part that did not. Curtis believed in the unexamined way that comfortable men believe things, that a building was a number and a tenant was a smaller number inside it, and that his job was to make the first number bigger. Walter had hired him in a busier season of his life and had in the years since handed him more and more of the day-to-day, until by that October Curtis was sending notices and signing leases and deciding rents with a free hand, and Walter, hollowed out by his quiet year, had stopped reading the reports as closely as he should have. Curtis had looked at 1140 Delmar in a quarterly review and seen a duplex renting under market, and he had done what he always did, which was raise it to market, without ever once walking the block to see who lived there. He did not know about Renee. He did not know about the swan towels, or the coffee can, or the 6-year-old in the yard. He knew that the unit was underpriced by roughly $200, and that the woman in it had paid on time for 6 years, which to Curtis meant only that she could probably be made to pay more. That was the machine Renee was caught in. Machines do not see the people in them. It would take a person to do that. It would take a man at a window who had started, without quite meaning to care. The first time Walter spoke to her, it was an accident, or the kind of accident a man arranges for himself without admitting he is arranging it. He came down to the lot on a Tuesday with no good reason, carrying a folder he did not need, and timed it so that he was crossing the gravel just as she finished. She straightened when she saw him, the way people do around a man in a good coat, a little wary, a little ready to be told she was in the wrong place. "That fence isn't yours to fix," he said, and then heard how it sounded, and felt the old clumsiness rise in him. He had meant it as a thank you. It had come out as a reprimand. Renee did not flinch. She looked at him steadily and said, "No, sir, it isn't. But it was letting the dogs in, and my little girl plays back there. I didn't figure anybody else was going to get to it. He had no answer to that. She was right, and they both knew it. He had owned that fence for 11 years and had never once gotten to it. "How long have you been keeping it up?" he asked. She thought about it. "Since the spring, I guess. It started coming apart around. Then the spring." He felt the word land somewhere under his ribs. While he had been standing at his window, unable to walk through his own silence, this woman had been quietly mending the thing between them, week after week, asking nobody for anything. "What's your name?" he said. "Renee," she said. "Renee Carter, I'm in the duplex, 1140. She said her address the way you say a thing you are not ashamed of, plain and level, and Walter, who owned that address and the 11 other buildings besides, opened his mouth to tell her so and found that he could not. Not because he wanted to deceive her, because he had spent so long being a name on a lease and a number to call that he did not know how to be a face in front of her, and he was afraid, suddenly and absurdly, that the moment she knew what he was, the easy levelness in her would close like a door, and she would start being careful with him the way the world had taught her to be careful with men in good coats. So he said nothing about the building. He said only Walter, and let her think he was a man with an office nearby, which was true, and not the man who held the paper on her home, which was also true. It was a small thing not to say. It would grow. They fell into a kind of acquaintance after that, the slow, weekly kind. He took to coming down on Tuesdays. He brought a second thermos cup the third week and poured her coffee from his own, and she took it because her hands were cold and because there was nothing in his manner that asked for anything back. They did not talk much. He was not good at it, and she did not need it. He learned the things you cannot see from a window, though. He learned that Maya was 11 and read 3 grades ahead and wanted to be a veterinarian. He learned that Tasha was 6 and had named every stray that came through the gap in the fence, which was, Renee admitted with a tired smile, part of why she kept fixing the gap, because a child who names things does not want them coming and going as they please. He learned one cold Tuesday when she was quieter than usual that she was worried about money, though she would not say how much. He saw it in the way she counted something out in her head while her hands worked, the same way he had seen it from the window. He did not press. He went back up to his office that morning, though, and did something he had not done in months. He pulled the file on 1140 Delmar. And there it was. The rent increase dated October, signed by Curtis on Walter's authority. $200 a month, effective at the turn of the year. He read it twice, the way she had read it twice at her kitchen table, though he did not know that. He sat in his quiet office with the file open and felt the year rearrange itself around him. He had done this, not his hand on the paper but his name behind it, his silence, his year of not reading the reports. The woman who had been fixing his fence in the rain since the spring was being put out of her home by a number on a spreadsheet, and the number had his authority under it. Here is where a smaller story would have Walter march down and announce himself, the rich man, revealing his power in a single satisfying stroke, the music swelling. Walter was not built for swelling, though, and the thing he felt was not the clean rush of rescue. It was shame. The plain, heavy shame of a man who has let a machine run in his name and only looked up when it was about to crush someone he had come to know by the set of her shoulders and the 3 taps of her palm on A² board. He did not want to be thanked. He wanted, with an intensity that surprised him, to have never let it happen. He could have torn the notice up that afternoon. He thought about it. He stopped himself, though, and the reason he stopped himself is the reason the story is worth telling. He did not want to fix it the way a man fixes a fence he owns, with a careless wave. Here, this is mine, I'll handle it. He had watched Renee fix something that was not hers, faithfully, for no reward, asking nobody, and he understood, sitting there with the file open, that what he owed her was not a grand gesture. It was the same thing she had been giving the fence all along. Attention, the willingness to actually look at what was in front of him and make it right, post by post, board by board. So he started looking, and what he found, the more he pulled the files, was that 1140 Delmar was not the only one. Curtis had been raising rents across the portfolio for 2 years quietly to market and past it on buildings full of people exactly like Renee, people one careful month ahead of the water, and the reports Walter had stopped reading closely had been full of it the whole time. 11 buildings, hundreds of people, and a man at a window, grieving, who had stopped looking. Walter did not sleep much that week. It was a different not sleeping, though, than the hollow kind he had grown used to. It was the not sleeping of a man with work to do. He called Curtis into the third-floor office on a Friday. He had the files spread across the desk, every notice, every increase, 2 years of them, fanned out so the whole pattern showed at once. Curtis came in comfortable, the way he always was, a coffee in one hand and his phone in the other, and sat down without being asked, and Walter watched him glance at the papers without recognizing what they were, because a man who signs that many notices stops seeing them, and that, Walter thought, was the whole problem laid bare in a single careless glance. "Tell me about 1140 Del Mar," Walter said. Curtis shrugged and set the phone face down finally, hearing something in the older man's voice. "Underpriced unit. 6-year tenant, always paid on time, brought it to market. Standard." "The tenant's name?" Curtis paused. He did not know it. Walter watched him not know it, watched him reach for it, and find nothing. Watched his eyes go to the folder, as if the name might be retrieved from a line item, and saw confirmed the thing he had already understood, that to Curtis, the woman who folded swans and counted quarters and braced a fence in the rain, was a blank space where a larger number should go. "Her name is Renee," Walter said. "She has 2 daughters. She has been repairing the fence on the empty lot beside that building, which I own every week since the spring, with her own hammer on her own time, for no reason except that it was broken and a child plays back there. And you raised her rent $200 without ever learning her name." Curtis began to say something about the market, about comparable units 3 streets over, about the duty they had to keep the portfolio sound. Walter raised one hand, not in anger, just enough to stop him. "I am not going to shout at you," Walter said. "I let this happen. I stopped reading. That's on me, and I'll carry it. It stops now, though all of it. Every increase you signed in the last 2 years on every building I want reversed by the end of the month, and I want to see the books myself, the way I used to before I forgot that a building is people." It was not a dramatic scene. Nobody was destroyed. Curtis did not crumble or confess to villainy, because he was not a villain, only a comfortable man who had stopped looking, the same sin his employer had been guilty of. And Walter knew it, and that was why there was no satisfaction in it for him, only the heavy work of setting a thing right. Curtis left the office smaller than he came in, not because he had been beaten, but because, for the first time in 9 years, someone had made him see the people behind the numbers, and a person cannot unsee that, not entirely. The notices were reversed. A letter went out to 1140 Del Mar and to every other building on plain paper saying the increase had been issued in error and was rescinded, with apology. Renee read it at her kitchen table the same way she had read the first one, twice, slowly, her finger moving under the line that mattered, as if the words might rearrange themselves if she looked away. Then she got up and took the first notice out of the coffee can, the one folded into careful quarters behind the bus fare, and she set the 2 papers side by side on the table, the one that had taken the floor out from under her and the one that had quietly put it back. She sat very still for a long moment. Then she did the thing she would not do in front of her girls, which was put her face in her hands and let her shoulders shake quietly at the kitchen table, in relief so large it had to come out somehow. When it had passed, she wiped her eyes on the heel of her hand, and she did not throw the first notice away. She kept it folded in the can. A person who has come that close to the edge does not forget where the edge is. She did not know Walter had done it. The letter was signed by the management company. As far as Renee knew, a mistake had been made and then unmade, the way mistakes sometimes were, and she said a prayer of plain thanks and went on. She did not connect the man from the lot, the quiet man named Walter, who poured her coffee on Tuesdays, with the paper on her home. Why would she? He had never told her. Walter was not finished, though, and the next part he did slowly, the way she had taught him without ever meaning to. He did not appear with a check. He did not announce himself. Instead, that winter, Things began to be repaired around 1140 Del Mar, in a way they never had been. The radiator that knocked all winter was replaced. The thin bedroom door that carried a mother's crying was rehung solid so that no sound passed it. A new fence went up along the lot, good cedar, set in concrete, and Renee came out one Tuesday in the grey hour with her father's hammer in her hand and stopped at the back step. The old fence was gone. In its place stood a straight, clean run of new boards, each one true, each post plumb, the whole line of it square. In a way, the old fence had not been square in years, maybe ever. She walked the length of it slowly. She looked for the work that needed doing, the loose slat, the leaning post, the gap a dog could push through, the thing that was hers to set right. There was nothing. She set her palm against the new top rail, and it did not give. She stood there with the hammer hanging at her side and found to her own surprise that her throat had tightened because the small, weakly thing that had held her together through the hardest fall of her life had been quietly taken from her, and she did not yet know by whom, and she did not know whether to be grateful or to grieve. Walter was at his window. He watched her find the new fence. He watched her run her open palm along the top rail, 3 taps, asking the new wood if it agreed with her, and he made up his mind. He came down to the lot. It was cold and the light was grey, and she was still standing there with the hammer, and he crossed the gravel the way he had the first time, except this time he did not come with the folder he did not need. He came empty-handed, which for a man like Walter was the bravest way to come. "You won't have to fix it anymore," he said. "I see that," she said. "It's good work, better than mine." She smiled, but there was something held back in it, and he understood that the fence had been hers, in the way a thing you tend becomes yours, and that taking the work away was a kind of loss, even when it was a kindness. "Renee," he said, and then he told her his name was Walter Boyd, and that he owned the building she lived in, and the lot, and the fence she had been mending since the spring. He told her about the notice, and the man who signed it, and the year he had spent at the window, not reading the reports. He told her that the mistake on her rent had been his to answer for, and that he had answered for it, and that the radiator and the door and the cedar fence were not charity but something closer to an apology. From a man who had watched her take care of what was in front of her until he remembered that he was supposed to be doing the same. Rennie listened to all of it without saying a word. She did not move. Quote, "The hammer hung at her side, and the grey light lay flat across the new cedar, and Walter could not read her face. And it frightened him, because he had been right about one thing all those weeks ago. He had been afraid that the moment she knew what he was, the easy levelness in her would close like a door. And for a long moment he thought it had. He thought he had traded the one good thing in his hollow year for the relief of an honest confession, and that she would gather herself up the way she gathered her tools, neat and final, and go inside, and never again pour his coffee in the grey hour or tap her palm against the rail beside him. Then she said quietly, "You watched me." "From up there, all that time?" "Yes," he said. There was no softening it. "I did. At first because I didn't have anything else to look at. My wife passed in the spring and I'd forgotten how to be around people. And then, because you were the only thing I saw all year that wasn't broken, you were the one fixing things." The wariness went out of her. Then, not all at once, but the way a held breath goes out. She looked at this tired man in his decade-old grey coat, this man who owned 11 buildings and had stood at a window grieving, and learned her by the set of her shoulders, and she did not see a landlord, and she did not see a rescuer. She saw a person who had been alone in a high window and had come down. She knew something about being alone with a thing too heavy to say out loud. She had a coffee can full of those things. "I'm sorry about your wife," she said. Just that, the plainest thing. The thing that cost her. Because she meant it, and because she, of all people, knew that the size of a kindness is not in its grandness. They stood at the new fence in the grey light, 2 people who had spent a hard year, 100 yards apart, and something settled between them that did not need a name yet. The spring came back around the way it does. By then a good deal had changed, And not in the sudden way of stories, but in the slow way of real life, which is the only way that lasts. Walter read his own books again. He walked his buildings, all 11, and learned names, and the rents stayed where people could reach them, and Curtis Vale, who had not been fired, surprised everyone, including himself, by becoming, under a watchful employer, something better than he had been. Renee still cleaned rooms at the Carrington, but not as many because Walter had asked her, plainly and without making it strange, whether she might want to look after the upkeep of the duplex and the lot in an official way, with a small wage attached, since she had been doing it for free and doing it better than the men he paid. She had laughed at that and said she supposed she could be talked into getting paid for what she was going to do anyway. Maya got her wish years on. Though that is past where this story goes. She became the kind of person who takes care of the small living things that come through gaps in fences. And when people asked her where it started, she told them about a cold morning, and her mother kneeling in the dirt, and a thing her grandmother used to say, that you take care of what's in front of you, and you let God sort the rest. She had rolled her eyes at it once. She did not anymore. And Tasha kept naming the strays, though fewer came now that the fence was good, and the ones that did came in through the gate, which Renee left unlatched on purpose, because a fence is for keeping a child safe, and a gate is for letting the world in on your own terms, and she had earned the right to know the difference. On a Tuesday the following fall, in the grey hour she still kept for herself, out of habit, more than need, Renee went out to the yard and found Walter there before her, in the grey coat, looking at the fence. He was not fixing anything. There was nothing to fix. He was just standing in the place where, a year before, a woman he had never met had knelt with a hammer and quietly mended the thing between them, week after week, until a man at a window remembered how to come down. She came and stood beside him. Neither of them said anything for a while. The cedar had weathered to a soft grey over the year, the colour of the hour, and somewhere on the other side of it a child was calling a stray by a name. Only she knew, their breath showed in the cold. A bus sighed to a stop out on Delmar and pulled away again, and Renee did not have to run for it, and the not having to run for it was its own small mercy. She had not yet stopped noticing. "Holds up well," Walter said finally. Renee pressed her open palm to the top rail. 3 taps. The wood held, the way good work holds, the way a thing tended faithfully holds long after the hands that tended it have moved on to other repairs. "It does," she said. "It surely does. If you have ever fixed something that wasn't yours to fix, just because it was broken and in front of you and nobody else was going to, then you already know how this story feels from the inside, and I'd be glad to hear about it. And if a quite good person being finally fully seen is the kind of thing that stays with you, there is another one waiting, about a man who left the same small tip at the same diner for years and never once told them why. She fixed his fence every week, and she never knew who he was until the week she did. And what neither of them knew, on that first cold Tuesday, with a loose board and 40 minutes before the bus, was that the smallest faithful thing a person does when no one seems to be watching is so often the very thing that turns out to have been seen all along.